I was born and raised in Southern California. I grew up in a little town called El Monte and went to El Monte High School. And my parents were working class folks. My mother worked part-time most of the time in a bank. And my dad, I grew up with my stepdad, and he was a mechanic, and he also worked in a factory, Modine Manufacturing Company. My father passed away when I was about 9, my real dad. And he was a big influence in my life, and he was also in the Navy just before World War II, actually in 1939, or in the late 30s. And my stepdad that I grew up with was also in the Army, and he was actually in Normandy, and so he was an Army infantryman. My father, my real father, was a Navy radioman on a submarine, and so I had some and uncles and whatnot in the military. So I had a half brother. I still have my half brother, and he was also in the military. Eventually, we ended up in Iraq at the same time, not in the same location, but at the same time we were in Iraq. When I was 17, I wanted to join the military because I couldn't go to college, and I had an adventurous spirit, and I just wanted to see the world, and it looked like I wasn't going to be able to. So I asked my mom to sign for me when I was 17 years old to go into the military. I went to different recruiters' offices and finally ended up with the Air Force at the Security Police program. And I went into the recruiter's office, and there were all 4 branches actually. There was, except for the Coast Guard, but there was the Navy. I can still see that office. There was the Navy on the left, and then the Marine Corps next to them, and across the hall in the back of the office was the Army, and then the front was the Air Force. So I started, and I did a clockwise inquiry. First I started with the Navy. I went in there and talked with the recruiter, and they really needed people on submarines. They didn't need me at the moment, and they needed somebody like an electrician type thing. So I bumped on over to the Marine Corps, and they needed somebody else. I can't remember, but it wasn't for me. I think it was something clerical, and I didn't want to do anything clerical. I wanted to do something outdoors, and I was a hard charger. I wanted to experience military life to its fullest. So then I went over to the Army, and I was 16 years old, and they told me, "How would you like to be a helicopter pilot?" And I really, really liked that idea, but I didn't have enough confidence in myself. And I thought, well, I don't think I could be a helicopter pilot. I was only 16 years old, and I couldn't even conceive of that. So then I went over to the Air Force, and they had a great recruitment film on security police. And they were climbing up and down ladders out of silos, and they had M16 rifles, and they had all this stuff, and it looked really, really appealing and exciting. So that's the one I picked, and I went on, what do they call it, delayed enlistment. My mom signed for me, and when I was 17 and out of high school, I went right into boot camp in San Antonio, Texas. And I became a latrine queen, and yeah, so I really learned how to clean up bathrooms, and I learned how to lead a team, and I learned how to scrape soap scum off a tile with razor blade. So that was some of my wonderful boot camp training. The food was good, physicality, it was probably average. It wasn't too difficult. I was young, I was 17, so I made it through. And I was really happy that it was over with. So after boot camp, they sent me right kind of across the base to San Antonio, Texas for security police training. So I had a lot of training in kind of a law enforcement thing, and we did like riot control and things like that, accident investigation, and just all things related to law enforcement. My first duty assignment was Okinawa, Japan. When I got to Okinawa, I applied to get on the quick reaction force team. I don't remember if that's what it was called back then. This was 1977. 78, I spent the end of 77, 78, and part of 79 in Okinawa. All of my trainers were Vietnam veterans, and they trained us in booby traps, how to wire things up, how to create booby traps, how to take booby traps apart, and we had a lot of anti-hijacking training with the Air Force, as far as airplanes, how to get people off of airplanes that had been hijacked and whatnot, and rescue operations. Eventually ended up in Korea, and although it was a combat zone, I guess, I was never involved in any combat there in Korea. However, I had an assignment out on an ammunition dump to guard this place, and it had a perimeter fence all the way around it. And these little alarms would go off on the fence every once in a while, and sometimes it would be a bird, or, you know, it was usually nothing. So I would take my Jeep from my little guardhouse, I would take the Jeep and run around and find those, where those alarm zones had gone off. One day, most of the time it's boring and it's a bird or it's an animal or something, and one time I went out there and I found a pamphlet, and it was a North Korean pamphlet saying that I should come to the other side. And that gave me shivers, because somebody was out there, you know, in the middle of the night, dropping pamphlets and shaking shaking the perimeter fence. So, and I was alone for probably, my closest help was probably eight miles away. So that was interesting. In that same guardhouse, it was so freezing cold that I burnt the back of my boots on the heater because I couldn't even feel it. The heater caught my pants on fire, and I'm sitting there trying to put the smoke out. So it's a cold place, Korea. So then eventually I ended up at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, and that's where I currently live. I ended up here in Utah as a security police officer in 1984. So I ended up here, and then I got out and became a counselor at Clearfield Job Corps, and then went into the reserves. I went into the Marine Corps Reserves, and then I got a job with the Salt Lake City Police Department. So I quit the reserves because I had to go to the police academy. Eventually, as a police officer, I came back into the reserves, ended up in the Army Reserves, the 147th Transportation Unit out of Ogden. And in 2003, we were asked if there were any volunteers to go to Iraq. So I raised my hand, and they said, you need to report to a unit in Connecticut. And they were cross-leveling me to the 283rd Transportation Unit, Transportation Squadron in Connecticut. So I eventually flew to Connecticut January 2nd. I reported January 2nd, 2004. And I ended up with that unit, and we trained up at Fort Drum, New York. And we trained up about 3 weeks, and then we ended up in Iraq. So then I was at Fort Drum, New York, January. It was freezing, and we trained up, did a lot of training, and our job was to haul fuel, and we were going to be in convoys, and so we ended up flying to Iraq, and we eventually ended up there on a C-130 in the jump seats. We landed in a place called Anaconda in Balad, Iraq, which is just north of Baghdad. Our final destination was to be Tikrit. We landed there, it was dark, they put us on buses and they hauled us out to these tents, just a bunch of tents, looked like they'd been abandoned, but I guess they were just waiting for us. When we arrived, it wasn't a minute later, and just outside the perimeter we could see our whole unit was getting off the buses, and we were just unpacking and getting our cots laid out in the tents. And we could see a big old firefight right on the perimeter, probably 300 meters away. And Apache helicopters coming down and putting tracers. I don't know what they have, but they were shooting at the enemy who were on foot just outside our perimeter. And for us, we just kind of flew right into this, and it was like, what in the heck? And I was an older soldier. I was 44 years old, and a lot of my guys were 18, 19, 20 years old. And they don't know what happened, hey, what just happened to us? What's happening? Do we need to go out there, run out there and fight, or what's the deal? And we were just stunned. But the Apache finally went dark and went away, and that firefight, whatever it was, went away. And so we were exhausted because we'd been on airplanes for hours and hours, days it seemed, and we ended up going to bed, everybody crashed, and the next morning we got up and we started cleaning our weapons and just waiting for orders, and we were probably going to go get chow or whatnot, and one of the soldiers came up to me, one of my soldiers, came up to me and handed me his rifle because he'd gotten a Q-tip stuck in the gas pipe, or the gas tube of the M16, and I had just instructed him not to do that, not to use a Q-tip. But he did anyway. So he sat down next to me and he says, "Sarge, I was really scared last night. I couldn't even sleep." He said, "I heard people walking around our tent, and around our tent was gravel. They put gravel down for dust abatement. And he said he heard footsteps all around the tent last night, and he says, I was really scared." And I said, "It's all right. It's okay to be scared." It wasn't much longer into our tour that I saw that kid later. In his eyes, he had already fired off and probably killed a few people, and he was a seasoned soldier within a matter of months. So that was really interesting. So we made our way through convoy on up to Tikrit, where we were to have our base, our forward operating post. And so we set up operations in Tikrit at an old air base. It was an old Iraqi air base. And we did operations out of there. We conducted convoy operations all over the country of Iraq. Fallujah, Samarra, Kirkuk, Mosul, Balad, Baghdad, all over the whole country. Talil, all the way to to Camp Caldwell, which was right on the Iranian border. And we had many, many different combat experiences on those convoys. We were shot at. We had RPGs. They blew up our trucks. I think we lost 15 trucks to IEDs. I had a friend have his leg blown off with a mortar at Anaconda Air Base. And then, we were just getting hit. Seems like every other day that we'd go out, we would get hit. One of our trucks would get hit, blown up. It was really a scary ordeal. And we had weapons. We didn't have any protection but ourselves. We were it. I was with the 1st Infantry Division, and we were assigned to 1st Infantry, 1st ID. And we were getting hit all the time. On one particular occasion, my battle buddy and I volunteered to take what we call the Warlock truck, and it's a truck that we use to haul personnel. It's a personnel carrier, and it had an antenna on top, and it would jam signals of any IEDs that were in the area within a 300-meter radius. So we were in a convoy with another unit. It was just my battle buddy and me in a totally different unit where they needed this truck, and we had the clearances to be able to operate that truck. So we went. I took an M16 rifle. I normally carried a SAW, which is a squad automatic weapon. It's an M249. But on this particular day, and thankfully, I had an M16 rifle. And I was riding shotgun, so to speak. And we were in a convoy of 16 vehicles. We were number 10 in the line of march, and we were coming through Samara, one of the most deadly places in Iraq for convoys, because we were always getting hit there. And sure enough, we were coming up from Baghdad, we were coming up through Samara. There's a big overpass. We were on that overpass and we could see the front end of our convoy. And it turns out the third vehicle in the line of march was a small Humvee. And we had just talked to those people in that Humvee back at Balad, where we left from, probably 30 minutes earlier. And that Humvee just blew up, just completely blew up. And it was probably the largest explosion I'd ever seen in all this time. This was July 11th, 2000, July 11th, 2004. And it seemed like the IEDs kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and this was the biggest one I had seen. And it was almost hard to even grasp. It was surreal. And that bridge, even that bridge that we were on, it's like a freeway bridge, just a regular highway, freeway bridge, shook. That's how big it was. And this was, they were number 3 in the line of march, and it had to be a mile ahead of us, because we were 100 meters apart, and we were number 10 in the line of march. So anyway, it's quite a distance. So when we came down, we came through the smoke. There was still fire across the freeway. It was melting the asphalt. And we drove through that. And off to my right, through the smoke, and you could hear things like crackling and popping, and there's this little black, charred and burning, fully engulfed Humvee off to the right. And so we flipped a right-hand, kind of a right-hand U-turn to go back to them, and nobody had stopped the entire convoy. Everybody ahead of us had kept going, because that unit's policy was to keep going and let the rear gun truck take whatever happens, you know. So everybody went up, all the trucks went up, and they made a box formation, I don't know, 300 meters down up the road. And my battle buddy and I just jumped out, and then we came under fire. And we're coming under fire from these little mud houses off in the distance, and then from a berm off in the distance. And meanwhile, this Humvee's burning up, and a friend of ours, a female, is in the passenger seat, and she's burning up as well. Mike Steinman is out on the ground. His pants are on fire, and he's screaming, and it's just a pretty violent, awful, grisly experience. So my battle buddy runs out of rounds, because we're shooting back these guys, and my battle buddy runs out of ammunition and runs over to Mike Steinman, who's on the ground. And finally somebody comes up in another Humvee. Meanwhile, what I'm doing is just firing back and reloading and firing and reloading. And another person comes in a Humvee, I think, or another vehicle, I'm not sure, and comes around the other side. They put Mike Steinman, the injured troop, in the Humvee and take off with him. And we get Jeremy, who was also in the vehicle. There were 3 passengers. Linda Tarango Grease is in the passenger side, and the thing is on fire. We were able to get Jeremy out on the ground, and he has a gaping chest wound where he has lung matter exposed, and he's not with us. He's passed away. And but my battle buddy, he wants to bring him back to life, and is trying everything he can. And I'm trying to help in a way, and I'm trying to see if I can get her out of the Humvee, then going back and shooting at these guys, and just going kind of back and forth. It was very, very chaotic. Chaotic, grisly, it was hot, and then all of a sudden the ammunition in the Humvee that's burning up starts popping off. So I feel like I'm getting shot at from all directions, and so I'm returning fire, and finally the rear gun truck pulls up, and I'm thankful, because now instead of just me and all in these houses and these people shooting at us, I now have an M2, which is what we call a Ma Deuce, .50 caliber up on a gun truck, a real tall gun truck, and he takes over and starts helping me. And then finally somebody else shows up, and it's a captain, and he starts giving orders. Let's get this kid up and on a gurney or on a litter and get him into the back of my truck. So the entire time I'm shooting now, and now my job in my head is to guard these guys with my body and my rifle while they get him up on a litter, and I walk with them to the back of my truck, put down the tailgate with one hand, we get it down, and then they get him halfway up, and some part of his clothing gets stuck on a bench, and so they have to pull him all the way out, and we're still exposed to the enemy. And it's just a wonder that we didn't get all shot up there. But anyway, they had to turn his body around to get him in properly. And so they were finally able to do that, and we were able to mount up and turn around and go back up to 300 meters up the road to where the box formation is, and hook up with the rest of those folks, the rest of that unit. So we went up ahead and hooked up. That took about 40 minutes. It was about 40 minutes of firefight and trying to rescue and running around, and it was really, really intense. And I didn't realize, but at one point I was down on my knee and shooting, and there were bullets that were hitting places around me, and I guess a rock or something popped up and knocked the lens out of my eyeglasses. I wasn't wearing my goggles. I normally would have they're like sports goggles that I wear all the time. But this particular day, I was, for some reason, being casual, and I had just my regular glasses on, and anyway, it knocked out a lens for my glasses. I didn't even know it because I was so pumped with adrenaline. Anyway, so we went on up, and there were people in the back of my truck, because we were taking people to and from, like on leave, and that's why we had that truck that would bust up those IED signals, So we try to protect people coming to and from leave in that particular truck, and that's why we used it. They would call on us all the time because we had the clearance to use it. So anyway, so we had people in the back of the truck with Jeremy's body. There was a lot of blood. In fact, there was so much blood that there was blood in one of the coolers. We had a Coleman cooler with a little white lid, and for some reason, the water had melted in it already, but there was so much blood that the water inside that cooler had blood in it. So it was a grisly thing. So we get up to the rest of the trucks, and people that were in the back of my truck pile out. And one of the soldiers said, "I don't want to ride back there with the body, KIA." And that's fine. So somebody else volunteered to take their place, because we still had to gather up and leave. Meanwhile, this house over here, we want to take care of it. My battle buddy asked me if he could put a grenade on that house, and I granted him permission. Meanwhile, we had called QRF to come and clear the house, clear the berms and whatnot. So he went and he put down some grenades on that, and I think they were 40 millimeter grenades. The first one went over the house. The second one hit the roof and did what it was supposed to do. I think he used 2 to 3 grenades on that house and collapsed the roof. QRF showed up. We left the whole thing to them and took off. We went to the nearest base, which I believe was called Brassfield. It was a forward operating base, and we pulled in there, and I met with the mortuary people, and it's a really long story and pretty emotional, but we took him off the truck and put him on pallets, and that was the extent of the morgue, was on regular wooden pallets. And we just stuck him on there, and they had just a little canvas sheet over the top for a roof. It wasn't even a roof. patted us on the back, gave us cold water. I couldn't even drink the water. I was shaking so bad that it just dribbled all over my face, and I couldn't even drink water. I was just so affected by all that, and we all were. There were other people who had singed eyebrows from driving through that fire, because the fire engulfed the whole freeway, and so some burn injuries. Yeah, it was a pretty bad experience. So we gathered up and we went on up to Tikrit. Finally ended up there, and we went in and had a briefing with our commanders, the battalion commanders, and all the different people involved and in the chain of command, and explained everything that happened. And they took care of my truck, and they were really good to us, and they cleaned out the truck, and they came to me later and told me about the cooler and all the stuff that they saw. It affected the people that cleaned my truck. They were affected by all that as well. So it's not just one person that's in combat, it's everybody else.